Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Look around you. It's the easiest thing in the world to become blasé about the familiar, to take for granted the things that surround us. But as you walk out of Tanglin Trust School, think of how the country looked just in the 1980s, and then look at it today. And as you go to the mouth of the river, marvel at the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself. What alchemy, what magic transformed the mangrove swamps of one tropical island into the extraordinary, thriving hub of commerce that it has become today. You sometimes hear the argument that there is beauty in the free market. I would urge you to open your eyes and you can see that that phrase is literally true. That the market system is not just beautiful as an abstract theory, but that there is a pulsing, energetic loveliness that is immanent in a place like this. And if you can't feel that beauty, if you don't feel touched by what it represents, look a little bit more closely. How did it come about? What was it that was the secret ingredient of Singapore's success? Well, I think we've already heard part of the answer from Brian. 200 years ago, Raffles landed at St. John Island. At that time, the population of what is now Singapore was 120 Malays and 30 Chinese. The territory had no significant resources other than, of course, the natural harbour. This is not a place that sits on diamonds or oil or any great natural resource. But Raffles had big dreams, big plans. He leased the island and then bought it from the Sultan of Johor. And then in 1823, he made the following declaration: "The port of Singapore is a free port, and the trade thereof is open to ships and vessels of every nation, equally and alike to all." Now that doctrine of unrestricted free trade that didn't depend on reciprocity, didn't depend on what the other country did in return, was at that time unique, groundbreaking. Yes, the theories existed. We can't tell whether at that time Raffles had already come across the theory of comparative advantage, which David Ricardo had set out 3 years earlier. This bizarre, counterintuitive notion that it always pays you to trade even with a country that is more efficient and more competitive than you, that it always works in the interests of both. It's been called justly the only idea in the whole of economics that is both surprising and true. Whether or not he was familiar with the works of Ricardo, he was certainly familiar with the works of Adam Smith that had been set out a generation earlier, in 1776. Adam Smith had a great gift for making difficult ideas sound every day. He was very good at using ordinary language. He was not one of these economists who wrote in equations. He made a beautiful argument against protectionism when he asked people to consider why we don't try and make wine in Scotland. He said it would be possible if we had enough greenhouses. We could grow some grapes in Scotland. And from those grapes, we could no doubt press something that tasted a little bit like claret for maybe 30 times the cost from which we import the wine from Bordeaux. He said, but would anyone regard it as a reasonable approach to economic policy to keep out the wine from Bordeaux in order to encourage the building of these greenhouses in Scotland? And he had this gift for the demotic. And I think there is evidence that Raffles was very familiar with that argument. But what was not at that time familiar, what didn't really exist anywhere else, was the practical application, the realization of that philosophy. If you look at almost any other colonial settlement in this part of the world, the Dutch, the Portuguese, almost all of them were based on the then prevalent idea of mercantilism, which is the idea that a nation gets rich by running surpluses, by selling things more than it buys, and by treating colonies as generators of resources and wealth for the metropolitan colonial power. So Singapore, in that sense, was deeply experimental. The idea that actually, simply by lifting all barriers, by inviting the traffic and commerce of all nations alike and equally, everyone would be better off. And to quote another part of Prime Minister Lee's speech, he said, "Because of Raffles, Singapore became a British colony, a free port, and a modern city." Note the succession of those things. The extraordinary wealth that has turned the 5.6 million people of this country into the territory with the 8th highest GDP in the world. And most of the states above are minuscule microstates. That is something that came from a particular approach to trade and economics that moved the rocks and let the grass grow, that liberated the energy and enterprise of a free people. And I suspect that that success is why Singapore feels confident and happy in celebrating this bicentenary at all. There are some former British colonies where it would be completely taboo to mark the moment of the British arrival as any part of the national story, except in an angry and anti-colonial spirit. Singapore is perhaps not unique, but unusual in being able to celebrate this part of its story. And there are some fairly obvious reasons for that. One is that there was no terrible struggle here. Independence came as a process that turned Singapore from an increasingly self-governing colony into an ally, and an ally that has remained a military and diplomatic friend to the UK ever since. But I think also part of why Singapore is able to celebrate 1819 in a way that not every former colony has is that Singapore has now plainly surpassed the old colonial power in almost any metric of standards of living or economics. And that breeds a commensurate self-confidence. Here are the figures. In 1950, average income in the United Kingdom was $11,920, and in Singapore was $5,690. In other words, Singaporeans in 1950 were about half as rich as citizens of the UK. By 2016, holding prices constant, allowing for purchasing power parity, income per head in the UK was $42,280, and in Singapore, $82,170. In other words, during that period, Singaporeans went from being about half as rich as British people to being nearly twice as rich as British people. And let me ask again, based on what? On what great resource? This is a territory that has to import its food, its drinking water, its electricity, based on the greatest resource that any nation has, which is the ingenuity and enterprise of its people, and on the understanding that the role of government is to create a system where that ingenuity is given free rein, and where the incentives are so structured that enterprise is rewarded and people are encouraged to pursue their self-interest by offering a service to those around them. I should just, in the spirit that Brian began, anticipate what is a common criticism of the Singaporean model, and particularly one hears this from the far left in Britain at the moment. Singapore, to the Corbynites in the United Kingdom, has become almost a swear word. The Labour leader likes to say, these Tory Brexiteers want to turn us into a kind of Singapore. Corbyn called it a bargain basement economy like Singapore. First of all, I'm not sure what's wrong with bargain basements. It seems quite an odd prejudice to have that he doesn't like people being able to buy stuff cheaply. But I would argue that on almost any possible metric, you would be better off as a poor person in Singapore than as a poor person in Britain. And if, as a progressive politician, your main interest is in the welfare of the least privileged, you should be looking at this territory as a place to learn from. Again, let's look at some of the outcomes. The UK healthcare system, which is always held up as the great egalitarian defence or the great egalitarian justification for the British left, enjoys a degree of public support of 57%. The system you have here, rather unique system of individual healthcare accounts, enjoys the support of 86%. It's almost off the scale compared to other countries. If you want to look at the metrics that really measure in the most, the way that you can most easily gauge the overall welfare of the population, infant mortality. In the UK, 3.6 per thousand. That is, infants who don't make it past infancy. In Singapore, 1.7. The population is, in that sense, nearly twice as healthy. Longevity in the UK, since 1915, the figures that I was quoting earlier, has increased from 71 to 81. Okay, not bad. Like every other country with a more or less open market system, we're all richer. But in Singapore, over the same period, the improvement was an overwhelmingly more impressive 66 to 83. So it is a great mystery to me why leftist politicians the world over hold up Singapore as some terrible Dickensian model where the poor are ground down. I know it is human nature to see the flaws close to home. We all do it. In every country, people focus on the things that are going wrong, but believe me when I tell you, my friends, there is no other country in this region that would not gladly swap your problems for their problems. The idea that a low tax and low regulation economy is a low wage economy, which is what underpins this criticism, is the opposite of the truth. Wages here are extraordinarily high by regional standards, indeed pretty good by global standards. I was speaking last week to Sir James Dyson, and he made this point. He said, look, no one could accuse me of shifting manufacturing to Singapore because I'm after cheap wages. I've managed to find one of the few places where wages are higher than in Western Europe. But I've come here because intellectual property is protected, because there is a secure legal system, because the legal system is open to the individual seeking redress, because the regulatory and taxation system has been designed in order to stimulate private enterprise. And that's the formula that generates the revenue that allows any government to look after the poorest and least fortunate. But I don't want to stand here and claim that this is all because of Raffles. I mean, that would be overdoing it. Yes, it was fantastic to have had a system based on private property, open markets, and free competition. But go back to those figures I was quoting. You can see that even in 1950, Singapore still had some way to go. The real jolt, paradoxically, and it was not something that was widely expected at the time, was independence. Singapore's hard Brexit, if you like, in 1965, a more or less ill-tempered split with a larger federation. And what's interesting is if you look at the Cleverdick opinion of the world in 1965, how people were writing in the Financial Times and the Economist and so on, almost all the smart money then was on Malaysia. It was assumed that Singapore, as a poor and small territory, would not be able to flourish without the support of a larger unit. Exactly the same argument, indeed, that is made about Brexit, by exactly the same kinds of people, if not exactly the same individuals. Now, of course, what actually happened is that following 1965, the government here embarked on some radical economic reforms aimed at attracting investment, cutting taxes, improving the education system, and removing any remaining barriers to trade and investment. In his lengthy memoirs, Lee Kuan Yew speaks about 1965 as the moment when we plugged in to the global economic grid. It's a great metaphor. It's what successful countries do, balancing the interests of other countries, but always looking to maximize the advantage of trade. Could Brexit lead to something similar in the United Kingdom? Well, of course it could. Brexit on its own doesn't add a single farthing to our national wealth. It removes constraints and it allows us to make different choices. And one of the choices that we could make is to do what Lee Kuan Yew did here following 1965. By the way, not a program that had particularly been planned. Up until that time, the People's Action Party still saw itself very much as a socialist party. They did not go into this with a preconceived Thatcherite agenda. They were reacting to events. And something similar might yet happen in the months ahead in Britain. We've already made clear that following a split with the EU, if there is no deal, we will still cut our tariffs vis-à-vis EU imports. Why wouldn't we? I mean, crazy to push up prices for our own consumers and our own businesses who use supply chains in Europe. But if you do that, then under World Trade Organization rules, you are obliged to do the same with everybody else. It's called the most favored nation rule. Once you say we don't have any tariffs vis-à-vis the European Union, we have to offer the same deal to Ecuador and Vietnam and everybody else. And so, just like Singapore a generation ago, we would find, if you like, that we've been compelled to adopt the policies that Stamford Raffles first upheld. Now, why should what I'm saying even be controversial? I mean, we have ample evidence that free trade works. Singapore is an outstanding physical proof. But actually, you can look at this in almost any metric. The moment when a country decides to join the global market system is the moment that it starts raising living standards for all its people, but particularly for those who were previously least well off. Why should this even be controversial? We've seen the most extraordinary advances in human prosperity, in literacy, in longevity, in infant mortality, in female education, calorie intake, any metric you like, in countries that have joined the global market system. And yet, bizarrely, all over the world, in developed and in developing countries, altruistic people, well-meaning young people, are protesting trade agreements, demonstrating outside G20 meetings, occupying stock exchanges, believing that somehow they are standing up for the poor against big corporates, when of course, in opposing free trade, they are doing precisely the opposite. Nobody lobbies for more restrictions and more distortions than the large multinationals. Nobody gains more from their removal than the poorest people on the planet. Why can't we see it? Well, I think there are three reasons. And I'm going to run through them very briefly. I think one is psychological, one is political, and one I can only call aesthetic. Let's start with the psychological problem. Free trade is, in the exact sense of the word, counterintuitive. It doesn't gel with the instincts and intuitions bred into us by a million years of evolution. Our brains are still on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. We have the inherited hunter-gatherer desire to store food, to provide against famine. The idea of being dependent on strangers for things that you can't see flies in the face of those instincts embedded deep in our DNA. And for that reason, the mercantilist, now as in Raffles' day, is able to fall back on a series of false assertions that sound perfectly plausible. When someone like Donald Trump says, we can't carry on with a trade deficit, or we need to be self-sufficient in food, or we can't compete with low-wage economies, or there are certain strategic industries that we need to defend. All of those things sound perfectly reasonable. It requires a little bit of education, or at least a little bit of thought, to see why they're not, but most people don't have the few moments that would take. And so they go, if you like, with their gut instinct, which tells them that free trade feels wrong, even though empirically we can show that it works every time it's tried, and always works for all the countries involved. The second reason, this is the easier one, is the political reason. And I can summarize this reason in 4 words. Free trade brings concentrated losses, dispersed gains. Consider the steel tariffs that Donald Trump has applied in the United States. They may very slightly improve the employability of 100, maybe 120,000 people involved directly or indirectly in steel. They will cost a great deal more from the 5-6 million workers who use steel one way or another, as construction workers, in aeronautics, in cars or whatever. But it's the steel workers who are aware of the issue. It's not everybody else. If Donald Trump tomorrow said, we are buying all the steel that China can sell us, and we don't care if the Chinese are subsidizing its production. We don't care if they're dumping it on us. You know what? If the Chinese are foolish enough to subsidize the production of steel, we will take that as a gift from the Chinese taxpayer to the American consumer. Thank you very much. Suppose he were to do that. Almost every American would be slightly better off. Yes, there would be some small, concentrated losses in some parts of the steel industry, but almost everyone else would be a bit better off. Prices would fall, consumers would then have way more to spend on everything else, so there'd be a huge lift to the whole economy. And I can tell you as a politician that at the end of that process, not one American voter would say, oh great, I'm $67 better off this year, I'm going to vote for the guy who did that trade deal with China. But the unemployed steel worker in Flint, Michigan or whatever, he will know exactly whom to vote for and will. And that's why there is always the distortive effect that although free trade always works net for the country, it tends to disfavor some old and politically connected and often unionized industries which have a stranglehold over policy. Which brings me to the third reason, the one that I can only describe as aesthetic. I grew up in Lima, Peru. And Lima in those days was a poor city, surrounded by shantytowns, by slums. Barriadas, they were called locally, las barriadas de Lima. And when I was a boy, we would often have friends, visitors coming from Britain, from Europe, from the United States. And you know, they'd do the usual tourist thing that people do in Peru. They'd come to Lima and then they'd go and they'd fly off to Cusco, they'd do the Inca Trail, they'd go to Machu Picchu. And when they came back, they would almost always ask the same question. Why, they would ask, do people leave these beautiful, scenic Andean villages and come down to these shanty towns to live among the traffic fumes and the open sewers? It's a very first world question. No Peruvian ever needed to ask why somebody would leave a village where there was no electricity, no running water, no school, no clinic, no job. Peruvians understood, in a way that foreign visitors didn't, that the barriadas, the shanty towns, were transitional. That for most people, they were a phase on their way to somewhere else. Much later in life, I had occasion to spend time in one of the barriadas. And I have to say, there was more of a spirit of enterprise and industriousness there than I have found in some high unemployment black spots in Europe. Everybody was busily engaged in something. They were selling things at traffic lights. They were sorting through rubbish and selling it for recycling. Everybody had a sense that they were on their way somewhere else. And although the economic standard of living was far lower than even the poorest parts of the United Kingdom, there was a hopelessness in parts of the UK that I just didn't find in those places. And this is the point that is missed by our geography syllabus, by our TV news reports, by our documentaries, which have basically a dislike, a finicky dislike of the ugliness that comes with the first phase of industrial development. The Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope once wrote, "Poverty, to be scenic, should be rural." And sadly, that observation tends to inform and infuse a lot of our thinking about international development. And so those objections, all of them wrong, all of them fake, all of them demonstrably false when you look at the data, the psychological, the political, and the aesthetic, all of them can be overcome. How? By going ahead and doing it successfully. When Singapore or Hong Kong or New Zealand or any other country that is embarked on a policy of unilateral free trade goes down that road, it soon becomes impossible for people to want to go back because they can see the outcome. And that's what I hope most for the United Kingdom, that we will use leaving the European Union as an opportunity to revive a stalled global trading system. And here is our opportunity to renew our partnership with friends and allies on more distant continents. When we joined what was then the European Economic Community in 1973, you could still make the argument for regional trade blocs. A lot of trade was local because we were constrained by the difficulties of travel and long-distance transportation of that era. But the arguments for regional trade blocs have been completely overtaken by technology. This is an age where there is cheap freight and cheap refrigeration, the age of internet communications, low-cost airlines. Geographical proximity has never mattered less. What counts now is cultural and political proximity. And Britain now has an opportunity to re-engage with countries that share its common law system and its approach to economic regulation. And here is where I see opportunities now to strengthen the relationship between the UK and Singapore. A company here, particularly in the services sector, will very naturally interlock with one in the UK. They're both English-speaking. If there's a dispute, it'll be arbitrated in a legal system that they're both familiar with. There is regulatory interoperability. If you're a barrister or something, you don't need to re-qualify. Almost all the professional qualifications are the same, or at least are compatible. That is not true within the European Union. So now, as distance becomes less of an issue, Britain has a particular opportunity to re-engage with those countries that share its legal, linguistic, and political heritage. And I particularly want to focus on Singapore because this territory has been the leader in modern free trade deals. Singapore realized earlier than most places that trade was not about agriculture and tariffs on old industries. That it's now about intellectual property, it's about data flows, it's about having a system of mutual recognition that will allow people to trade successfully. And this, I think, is the great opportunity that we now have. And by we here, I mean the broader community of free English-speaking common law states. Those that have this community of identity based not on blood, but on political institutions and a shared habit of mind. We could have a different way of doing trade deals. One that instead of depending on standardization and regulation and common rules and all of the things that are exploited by cartels and by big corporates, one that simply says whatever is legal in your country is legal in ours and vice versa. And if we did that, it would massively transform the way trade is done, and it would lead the world into a great new era of prosperity, unlocking billions more, because all you have to do is trust people and trust to their enterprise and their ambition. 200 years our countries have worked together in the cause of freedom and free enterprise. We're just getting started.